This is going to be the first in a series where I take a deep dive into the background, design, and history of various rolling stock used around the world. As I live in Sydney, and my first video was on the Bradfield scheme, it seems only natural to discuss the trains originally envisaged for this plan, which we know as the Bradfield stock. To begin with, how did the Bradfield trains originate? Back in the early 20th century, Sydney was growing rapidly, but its rail network clearly was lacking behind. At the time, suburban trains were exclusively hauled by steam locomotives. While they could do the job, they were slow, dirty, and costly to operate. And with Sydney's growth, these issues were only to be exacerbated. What Sydney needed was a radical redesign of its rolling stock. Thankfully, there was a new option: electrification. Electrification had a few main benefits. Primarily, that electric trains could operate in long tunnels, were quieter, and could accelerate faster. For Sydney, this wasn't necessarily a new concept. Sydney electrified part of its tram network in the late 1890s, and on an international level, cities like New York and London had proved that electric heavy rail was viable. So, for Sydney, it seemed to be a natural option. The majority of this work was undertaken as part of the Bradfield plan. This video is primarily going to focus on the Bradfield stock, so I'm going to save the more niche details for a future video. The most relevant piece of information is that Sydney needed new trains, and they were to be electric. The decision to electrify left the government with a conundrum. Between 1877 and 1916, Sydney had built 780 suburban coaches for steam-hauled service. It obviously would not have been viable to scrap and replace them all with new electric trains. So, Sydney needed some way to integrate the existing steam-hauled stock into the new fleet. There were two main options: electric locomotives and multiple units. Electric locomotives were rejected for a variety of reasons, namely that they would be overall less efficient than multiple units, as well as being more expensive in the long term. Multiple units ended up being the final choice for a few reasons. The main advantage is that the motors could be mounted in the cars themselves, which gave greater passenger capacity and traction. But the major downside was that the cars themselves needed to be designed with the addition of motors in mind. The issue was that none of Sydney's existing suburban fleet were, so new cars would have to be ordered. From there, it was decided that 101 new cars would be ordered with the ability to be converted into motor cars. This order was further broken down into two types, with 43 EBB first-class carriages and 57 EFA second-class carriages. For the trailers, as mentioned before, these would be made up of the existing steam-hauled carriage stock, but not all carriages were to be used. These were divided into three groups, the first being 193 steel-framed wooden body carriages designated as BB and FA, which were completed in 1916. Because their strength was in the frame, these cars were completely rebuilt. The main modifications included the cars being widened from 2.9 to 3.2 metres, which allowed for a 3+2 seating arrangement instead of the standard 2+2, as well as the addition of 3 doors on each side instead of the single door connected to each end platform. The second group of cars were older, consisting of 132 cars built between 1910 and 1912. These cars had wooden underframes, with their strength coming from the wooden trusses running underneath the windowsills. As a result, the cars were unable to be widened, nor have their entrances modified like the previous cars, as doing so would compromise their structural integrity. Instead, the main modifications was to the end platforms, which were enclosed. One important note on these cars is that I have no evidence they were ever converted. The only reference to their conversion is the 1926 paper by the New South Wales Government Railways that most of the images and information in this section have come from. I unfortunately have no source that discusses why these carriages weren't converted. If you have a source or any information as to why, please comment below, because I'd love to know. Back to the topic at hand, the final group consisted of 455 cars that were too close to the end of their useful service lives for modifications to be warranted. So, it was decided not to modify them and to use them on non-electrified services outside of the electrified network. In total, the Bradfield fleet consisted of 101 motor cars and 193 trailer cars converted from steel frame carriages. When electric service began in 1926, the EBB and EFA cars had their motors and electrical equipment added. This consisted of a double pan slider type diamond pantograph for power, an electro-pneumatic stepped resistor control connected to two 360 horsepower motors on one bogie. The choice to power only one bogie may seem odd, but this is primarily done on a cost basis. The powered bogie was located directly below the pantograph. Post-conversion, most carriages were redesignated as C cars, with C designated a car with motors and a crew compartment, and they were numbered C3000 to C3100. Only 91 were converted to start, with 10 cars having their motors but no crew cab installed. Because of this, they were designated with the letter N. These cars had their cabs added between 1928 and 1929, and in doing so, were redesignated as C cars. 184 of the converted trailer cars were redesignated from BB and FA cars to T cars, which means a car with no motors or crew cab, while 9 were converted to D cars, with them having no motors but crew cabs installed. All trailer cars were designated T4101 to T2884 and D4001 to D4009. In service, the Bradfields generally were arranged into semi-permanently coupled sets, alongside the standard Suburban stock, which I will discuss in a future video. These sets were mostly 4 and 8 cars, but also included a few 2 and 6 car trains. In general, 2 4-car sets would be coupled together as an 8-car set to fulfill peak hour demand, and the same goes for the 2 and 6-car sets. In general, each set had a ratio of 1:1 between motor cars and trailers. From the images I've shown thus far, you may have noticed that the Bradfields don't look like the trains that came after them. The motor cars have 4 doors per side and no dedicated crew cab door, while the trailers had 3 doors per side. All cars after the Bradfields had 2 doors per side and dedicated crew cab doors. This design choice primarily stems from the fact that Sydney, and Australia as a whole, had very little experience building modern suburban railways at the time. So as part of the design process for the network, it was decided that John Bradfield would do an overseas trip in 1915 to study how the British, Europeans, and Americans operated their railways. It was during this trip where Bradfield would visit New York and saw the trains used by the Interborough Rapid Transit Company and the Brooklyn Rapid Transit Company. Comparing these cars to the final Bradfield cars makes the inspiration very clear. So why was this dropped from later trains? It's simply because it wasn't deemed as necessary, so it was chosen to only use 2 doors instead for all future trains. During their lives, the Bradfield trains never had any major issues, at least as far as my research can tell me. Due to their bodies being made of timber, they were all replaced by 1975, with newer S-set trains taking over their roles. In the 1950s, a fair portion of the fleet had their roofs replaced by Tulloch, and sometime during the 1960s, the fleet was rebuilt with a 2-door layout of later Suburban trains, but there are no sources as to how many were converted or the specific year. Bradfield power cars were also used in sets with the Tulloch Double Decker trailer cars beginning in 1964. Not many of the Bradfield trains were preserved. The only car on display is C3045 at the New South Wales Railway Museum at Thirlmere, and it is owned by Transport Heritage New South Wales. They also own trailer car T4279, which is stored at Redfern alongside their other preserved electrics. An additional car is owned by the Sydney Electric Train Society. C3082 is currently stored apparently. Wikipedia also lists the Hunter Valley Railway Trust as having 3 motor cars, 2 trailers, and 1 driving trailer. But their website is dead and Wikipedia has no sources, so I'm not able to verify that either. For the final part of this video, I'm going to try and address a few questions that people might have that don't really have anywhere else to go in this video. First off, why were they made of wood? It's a logical question, especially since the standards that entered service not long after were made of steel, and wooden-bodied trains aren't necessarily safe inside of tunnels. It primarily stems from practicality. Sydney needed new trains, and New South Wales could only produce wooden-bodied trains. And since the technology to build steel-bodied trains wouldn't come until the latter part of the 1920s, they built the Bradfields out of wood. If they wanted steel-bodied carriages, they would have to import them, which is also why the first standards were built in the United Kingdom. Next, why were the non-control motor cars and driving trailers ordered, and why so few? There isn't a reason provided in any of the sources I have. My assumption in regards to the N cars is that they were to save money. A motor car instead of a permanently coupled 6 or 8 car set doesn't really need a crew cab, so it was decided just to skip them for a bit to spread out the costs. As for the driving trailers, my assumption is it was for the 2 car sets. So you would have a C and a D car working together. That way you keep the normal ratio of 1:1 for motor cars and trailers, while also not wasting a motor car. Another reason would be that you can't really operate 2 motor cars right next to each other. In order to maintain contact with the overhead wire, pantographs have to exert an upwards force on it, and having 2 pantographs right next to each other would end up deflecting the line too much, potentially damaging the line itself or the pantographs. As for why there were so few of either, it's because they didn't really need many. 4, 6 and 8 car sets could use the D cars when needed, and the full 1926 report only called for 4 2-car trains, so they just weren't needed. On a final interesting note is that the original plan from 1916 specified that the Bradfield trains would be all motor cars, which at 2 360 horsepower motors per car would total over 5,000 horsepower for a 7-car train. By comparison, a modern Waratah produces 4,000 horsepower for an 8-car train. I don't really have a reason for mentioning this fact, I just think it's a bit absurd. To conclude, I think it's a shame that these trains have been seemingly forgotten. There are very few sources of information on them, nor really any photos, which is a shame. I think they look good, and they're probably one of the most unique trains to ever operate on Sydney's Suburban network. Hopefully, this video brings more attention to the Bradfields, because in my opinion, with how good they look, how influential they were, they deserve that attention, and they deserve not to be forgotten.